Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Amy Wrzesniewski in New Haven, Connecticut. Amy is a professor of organizational behavior at the School of Management at Yale University. She researches the experience of work as a job, a career, or a calling. Her current research involves studying how employees shape their interactions and their relationships with others in the workplace to change both their work identity and the meaning of the job. Amy, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Angela.
Well, I am so excited to talk to you. I think I mentioned before we got started that you cover so many interesting topics. It was really hard to pick where to focus first.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I know a lot of people that I talk to are really interested in finding a job that they enjoy. And I'm curious from your perspective, how important is it to find sort of purpose and meaning in work? And do you think that, are there certain groups of people that put more of an emphasis on that than others?
So it's a fabulous question. And I think it's quite important to find purpose and meaning in work. And the kind of purpose and meaning that people find in their work, I would suggest matters quite a bit as well. So we know that, for example, 20% of the overall degree of sort of well-being and satisfaction people have in their lives is accounted for by the kinds of experiences they're having at work. And so that may seem like a small amount of variance, but in social science, that's actually a pretty big effect from the point of view of how much what's happening in our work and how we think about our work and how we're experiencing our work influences the rest of our life. In some of the research that I do, we look at the kinds of meaning people derive from their work, and what we find is people for whom the work has a purpose or a meaning beyond being a means to a financial end or being a means to career advancement is beneficial from the point of view of the impact that it has on how satisfied people are with their work, but also how satisfied they are with their lives overall, and how engaged they are behaviorally with the work they do. The second question you asked had to do with, are there groups for whom this is more important? One of the things I've had the most fun with in my research has been engaging in studies that have demonstrated, I think to the surprise perhaps of some of the people in the research literature that have come before, that people who are in jobs that we might consider to be lower status or requiring less in education and training and so on are often just as concerned with finding meaning in their work and seeing a purpose in the work that, again, goes beyond this is simply a means to a financial end or something of that sort. Beyond that, I would say there are certain cultures in the world, the U.S. is certainly one of them, that tends to put a lot of weight on what is happening in someone's work, what kind of work are they doing, trying to sort them, socially by what it is that their job is, and so on. And so I know people in this culture in particular pay a lot of attention to this, and a lot more attention, I would argue, than they ever have. But I would argue that's a bit of a separate thing from when it's just you and the work. How meaningful is that work, and what's the nature of the meaning that you're making of it?
That's interesting. I really hadn't thought about it in terms of sorting, as you go out culturally, but I guess it makes sense because sometimes when you go to a party or something, people ask you really quickly, what do you do? And it's almost like they're trying to sort of put you into a bucket.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there are cultures that where it's explicitly the opposite, where people don't talk and don't ask about what it is that you do for a living, with the idea that that's not necessarily sort of definitive of someone in society. And I think increasingly, if you look at the history of work over time, particularly in Western cultures, it has increasingly become both, how we are identified, if you will, by others, but also how we identify ourselves. And so what that means is it puts a lot more weight and pressure on what it is that's happening in the realm of work and who we are in that realm and what it is that we've accomplished than it would have in other times, sort of historically.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And I think also you mentioned your work can influence, I think you said 20% of sort of your overall happiness. I've got a couple of friends who are therapists, and they've talked to me about the fact that a lot of their clients will come in, and when their work is bad, that's the thing that's really dominating them when they're unhappy. I mean, that's what they want to talk about.
Yes. Though I don't work in this area, it's not surprising to me, particularly for people who, again, are professionals for whom their identity broadly within the workplace, but also outside, at their kids' soccer games, at, their places of worship and so on, to the extent that they see themselves as sort of carrying this identity as a primary marker or badge, if you will. If that isn't going well, if things are failing on that front, then it's quite a bit more affecting than if work is simply a place you go for a certain number of hours a week and collect a paycheck there, which has its own costs from the point of view of not seeing other kinds of meaning in the work, but is certainly protective from the point of view of thinking about what the potential costs are if things aren't necessarily going as well as they might be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned identity. I know for me, for example, I quit my corporate vice president job in 2012, so 5 years ago, and I didn't realize how much I associated myself with that title of vice president and how much I might miss it. I'm curious, how closely tied do you think our identities and our career are?
So it's a great question, and I think it sounds like there was some surprise that you felt over how much you had become attached to that way of knowing yourself, if you will. So I think that there's the potential for our identity to become sort of tied to our work to a great extent, and I think there are two sort of interesting ways in which that happens. So one is to come to identify with the profession that we're in, or occupation that we're in, as being definitive of the self, in which case, losing that occupation is potentially traumatic for people because it unmoors them, if you will, in the world. The other way in which I think identity becomes quite interesting when you think about how much that rides together with work in some ways is going back now, even, coming up, I think, about 30 years or so, 35 years, on research that's been done, longitudinal research in sociology that shows that aspects of our identity or personality that we tend to think of as being sort of quite fixed and quite, resides within us and is not, we take that self and that identity into workplaces and do the work of various occupations. Really compelling longitudinal research to show that, in fact, aspects of ourselves that we tend to think of as being separate from work and sort of quite stable are affected by the kind of work we do over time. And so the kind of work that you're doing can actually come to shape aspects of your identity in ways that I think, at least for the students I teach, I think is quite instructive, that these things are sort of co-constituted, what your work is and how you think about it and relate to it, but what that work is doing to you and how you come to understand yourself and respond to situations and who you eventually become.
That's so interesting. I mean, I think sometimes I feel like we don't realize how tied we are until, like in my case, until I was no longer working with that title. And then I think also there's maybe part of it, at least for me, that I didn't realize how much people treat you differently if you have that title versus if you don't, like external people, which I found interesting. I felt like there were a few people that in my case, I would have thought of as close friends that I started to think, I think they were actually only friends with me because they thought I could do something for them.
Yes.
And that's really upsetting.
It is, right? Because I think it creates an environment where you're not sure, are people relating to you as an individual? Are they relating to you for a title and for the access that could yield? And one of the best ways to, of course, see this firsthand is either to have an ascent or a descent professionally, where you realize that, suddenly you become everyone's sort of most favorite lunch partner and, person that they want to have come to the party and talk with them and so on. And particularly in professional contexts in which you were the same person, the year before or 5 years before, it becomes pretty easy to discern sort of how much of this, how many of these people were people who were interested in you kind of way back when, or are still interested in you if you've had a loss of status, or if you've changed occupations or job titles. Certainly sort of part of these relationships are strategic, and what becomes difficult is when that is represented, I would say, sort of differently, right, in terms of being about true interest in the person.
Absolutely. Wow. So another issue that kind of comes up a lot, I talk to people every single day who come in and say they're maybe 45 years old. They've had, maybe it could even be a really successful career, and they suddenly realize this is not what they should be doing with their life, and they're incredibly regretful about the choices that they've made. And I'm curious, why do we see that happening mid-career? Why does that occur?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I actually have a follow-up question for you before I dive in with some of my thoughts on this. How are they sort of characterizing the nature of the regret? Is it more about this? Why did I waste my time sort of doing this, or is it something more about I had always dreamed of doing X and instead I took a different path and I now regret that I hadn't done X? I'm very curious to hear a little more about what they're telling you.
I'll tell you so I think it typically is, why did I waste my time doing all of this for so long? It's not really fulfilling me.
Okay.
And rather than, and a lot of them come in and they're sort of like, I need to do something different, and I'm not really sure what that looks like.
Okay. So it's one of the things we know is in the realm of regret, that career and work-related regrets are at the top. So I think the last I know of this literature, they're second only to relationship-related and education-related regrets, so not surprisingly. And I would argue that education-related regrets are related to career regrets, right? Because the kinds of educational investments that you may have made can end up shaping the kinds of career opportunities that you might be able to avail yourself of. So, I'm not surprised necessarily about the age sort of point at which this is happening. So, a lot of interesting life course development work in psychology suggests that as people move through different stages of their lives, the puzzle or the problem that they're sort of working on changes, right? And so if at the beginning of our career we're working on, in some sense, establishing our independent identity of our peer groups and so on, and trying to come up with a motivating interest, by the time you're hitting middle age or late 40s and 50s, people become, and I'm speaking in generalities sort of from the research, but become more focused on thinking about, well, what has been the contribution of what I've done, and what kind of legacy is that leaving? And often at this stage, what you see is a reckoning, if you will, and a adjustment to wanting to do things that are more generative, whether that's mentoring other people or doing work that is going to, again, sort of produce positive outcomes for others. And if the focus of the career up to that point really hadn't been on those kinds of efforts, I think it's possible for people to suddenly feel as though what had been fine 10 years ago, 15 years ago, suddenly doesn't feel fine anymore.
That makes total sense. I mean, and I could see how it sort of evolves and changes. I mean, is there anything that we could do, say, in our 20s and 30s to kind of avoid this situation, or is this just inevitable?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable necessarily. I think, so I have a couple of thoughts on that. So first, I think to the extent possible, and I certainly encourage my students sort of in this realm. Most of them are in their late 20s and they're getting a terminal graduate degree, and then they're heading back into the workforce for ostensibly the rest of their careers, is to try to get them to think very hard about what is the ultimate purpose or impact to which the kind of work that you want to do is aimed. And, we know from research that doing the work because you feel that it is fun, or that you feel that the work is somehow sort of high-end status, or that it pays well, or what have you, is not necessarily as sustaining from a meaning perspective as seeing the work as being incredibly meaningful and important to the impact that it has on other people or on the world sort of at large. That, often if people feel that their efforts are being made on behalf of a problem or a puzzle or an opportunity that's much bigger than the self, it becomes easier to sustain a high level of motivation and a high level of engagement with that work, even when the going gets tough, even when, there are setbacks sort of at work, as opposed to that motivation being based perhaps more on extrinsic or instrumental areas of focus, in which case, when things start to become tough, it's, I think, harder to sustain that sense of meaning. The other thing I would say in relation to this question is that you could imagine, even in a case where the work has been fun, it's been about fun and challenge and climbing a ladder and, getting sort of ever higher status, that if at some point that feels or comes to feel like not enough, or like it's a source of regret, or someone's feeling motivated to make a change as a result, one of the things that I would encourage is thinking about, well, where you are in your career or where you are sort of organizationally, clearly by that point you've built a lot of personal capital, social capital, expertise, and so on in your area. Are there things that you could do to redirect your efforts so that from that perch that you've, ideally at that point, have made progress in earning, are there things that you can do that would feel more engaging, that would leverage your expertise, but leverage it in ways that contribute in ways that you hadn't even thought were possible to that point? And whether that's to the next generation of people coming up in the organization, or to the industry, or to the community in ways that you hadn't previously entertained, that can be a very meaningful shift where it's not necessarily about jumping ship and trying to move entirely into another occupation, which for some people may not be possible sort of structurally, and for others I think is probably terrifying to contemplate.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point, because sometimes, like when you do shift to a completely different career, sometimes you have to start with a much lower pay or something that it really makes it not so possible. Mm-hmm. And then I've also seen people who, they think that this particular organization, another organization, that's where it's going to be at. That's what will make them happy. And they switch. And it turns out they're in a similar situation that they were before. And so it seems like kind of working with what you have and looking for opportunities might be a more effective kind of strategy, I guess.
I think so. And this is the topic of some of the research that I've done with my colleague Jane Dutton at the University of Michigan and Justin Berg at Stanford University, to look at what is it that people are doing from within the boundaries of their work, of the jobs they're in, to change aspects of the tasks and of the interactions and relationships that come with the job and the way that they think about what it is that they're doing there, that people are quite proactive in changing not just how they think about the work, but the boundaries of how they're actually doing the work in ways that can be transformative of how they think about the meaning of the work and their identity in that work.
That's really interesting. And you also kind of mentioned earlier, it sounds like, my question was going to be around, if having sort of this purpose and this meaning can actually increase our success at work. But it sounds like that's kind of what you're saying. Is that true?
So there is evidence that people for whom the work is more, feels more fulfilling and like an end in itself, and that the work is contributing in some way to something beyond the self, that there's evidence from a variety of studies that these are people who feel sort of much more committed to the work that they're doing, who report being much less likely to leave that line of work. I know from research that I've done that they report missing less work, so lower absenteeism. I have an interesting unpublished finding where people who see their work this way, when they release their performance ratings, I can't really do much with it analytically because they all have the top performance rating in their firm.
Okay.
And so, and in ongoing research with colleagues of mine at Wharton and at Stanford, we're looking at what are the longer-term performance implications of this, both from the point of view of how the firm gauges someone's performance, but also how one's peers gauge their performance, and we find positive effects there as well.
Oh, interesting. Well, what happens when somebody has, say, two competing things? Like maybe they find that they have a lot of purpose, but maybe they're also driven by money. I mean, Is that does it make them even more successful or not?
It's a great question, and it's a question that I have explored, and many people have explored actually, to see, it stands to reason, I would think, to argue that if you have one motivation for doing something, having two different motivations for doing that same thing is even better, right? That one will shore you up when the other one is flagging, and, it may sort of strengthen and concentrate the power of the motivation to really perform and apply yourself. And what's interesting is a whole history of research, both in psychology and economics, has challenged this assumption to instead sort of show an interesting effect that essentially if the motivations that you have are both at one and the same time more internal or more intrinsic in some sense, and on the other side sort of more extrinsic or more instrumental, that the more instrumental motives tend to crowd out the internal motives to dampen their positive effect on outcomes. And so, this has been shown in really interesting studies of everything from having kids, color pictures, and then paying some of these kids in M&Ms for coloring those pictures, and then looking at, how likely are they to return to doing coloring in a free play period? They're less likely to return to doing coloring. The pictures that they produced under the payment scheme are judged by blind external sort of reviewers to be lower in quality, though, sometimes it's hard to tell what's a higher versus lower quality picture that's drawn by a very young kid. But and so it changes the nature of, how hard they're working, how well they're working, and so on. And I became very intrigued by this question with Barry Schwartz, who's a colleague of mine at Swarthmore College in Berkeley, Tom Kolditz, who's now at Rice University, and others, where we were curious to know, well, in the real world with adults over the long term, not in a laboratory setting, what is the impact of having different types of motivations for doing the same thing? And we engaged in a research project that followed 10 cohorts of West Point cadets for periods of up to 14 years. And so we looked at, this is a sample of about 10,000 people, to see, well, why did they go to West Point in the first place? And how did the nature of their motives for going there, or their multiple motives for going there, influence how well they did? Meaning, did they graduate West Point? It's a tough institution with not insignificant attrition. Having graduated from West Point, did they have to serve 5 years of mandatory officer duty? Were they flagged as being elite and eligible for early promotion during that period? And then after their 5 years of mandatory military service following the 4 years that they attended West Point, did they stay in the military into years 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, sort of following the time where they could have left? And what we find in each case is that having strong internal motivations for being at West Point, meaning you're there because you want to serve as an Army officer, that is your goal. The internal aim of the institution is also your own internal aim, that this is a powerful and positive input to the kinds of outcomes that we were looking at. But there are also other reasons why you could want to go to West Point. So people who go to West Point and then serve their military service are highly attractive to corporations who are looking for people who are well educated and have really led serious and meaningful things, which these people have under very stressful conditions and at typically quite high levels. So it's possible to go to West Point because you want a better set of career options later on, and you're looking perhaps for a more lucrative career, and people go there for that reason too. And so to the extent that you're there because you've internalized the aims of the institution, so you have more of an internal motivation, but you have your eye more on also this instrumental set of motives, what we find is holding both motivations damages the effect of the positive effect of the internal motives on all of the outcomes that we look at.
Oh, such a bummer.
Well, I mean, and I think in the end, that I don't want to sort of sounds scary with that effect. But I think what it suggests is, for everything we do, there are all kinds of effects that happen from it, right? So if you are very good at your job, you're going to do very good work that will have ideally, great impact on people, but you'll probably also be promoted and rewarded, and maybe you'll get a bonus if that's, part of what happens in the profession that you're in, or maybe you'll get raises and so on. And so, there are all of these positive sort of internal things that are happening, but also more instrumental things that are happening. And it's not that, you shouldn't reward people well, or that there shouldn't be these positive externalities that happen as a result of being engaged and performing well. I think the danger is in coming to believe that the reason that you're working hard and the reason that you're engaging in this activity is because of the more sort of external and instrumental kinds of outcomes that you're experiencing. I think the more powerful and sustained motivation is, again, sort of thinking about, well, what is it that this work is accomplishing that you care about, even if none of the other, again, sort of more external outcomes were happening. And so it's not that, we shouldn't sort of pay attention to the fact that we're paid well, or ideally that we're paid well, or that we're being recognized, but to not confuse those things with the core motives for why we're working in the first place.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Wow. Okay. Well, so one situation I also see a ton is when somebody's coming in and they talk to me and they say, I'm really looking for more meaning in my work. I've been working in corporate forever. I really think I'd be happier in a nonprofit. I really think that's where the good things are happening. From your research, do you find that to be the case, that if we just would switch to a nonprofit, we'd be more fulfilled?
I think the answer to that is complicated. I think, for some people, I'm sure that's the answer, right? That, moving into work that is more directly about, humanitarian or global benefit or environmental benefit could feel sort of much more fulfilling. At the same time, though, I think having, I work in an institution where many of our students come from and go into jobs in the nonprofit world. And one of the things that I think is a risk for people who come from private sector corporate jobs and go into nonprofit jobs is that I would argue in many of these organizations, the structure of the work, how things are run, are shockingly different than what they're used to, in ways that I have seen sort of really can surprise people with how much they're frustrated by that, and how much that in some sense interrupts the experience they were hoping to have, which is of, I think, at the extreme, sort of being blissed out at doing work that really is having a positive impact on the world, where instead they feel like they're being faced with daily frustrations about how difficult it is to get things done as easily or as efficiently and effectively as they had gotten used to in the world that they had come from. So that creates enormous opportunities for improving how work is done sort of in the nonprofit sector. But I think the reality is often more complicated than people anticipate.
I think you're right. And actually, as you were saying that, I thought of something that didn't even occur to me until now. But, I worked in corporate my whole career, except for a brief time, like a year, I went and worked in a nonprofit. And I remember how shocking it was to me, because it was the same kind of work, but just at a nonprofit. And the way that politics worked, the way that you got things done, it was so different than what I ever saw in corporate.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think again there are aspects of that create, I think, powerful opportunities. There are aspects of that are part of the design and the idea of how the nonprofit sector works, and I think being sort of prepared for that, right, and for the contrasts of that, suggests that that there needs to be, to make that really compelling, there needs to be a very strong and sustained sort of reason for wanting to work on problems in that area, sort of in that way. Whereas you could also think creatively about if it's a problem, say, around energy or, something like this, are there private sector ways that may be more suited to the person depending on their career history, where they could be trying to have that kind of impact, but from a different perch? Because, again, my research would suggest that if you're if you're working on something that you feel matters, where you feel like this is making the world a better place, where you feel deeply engaged by it, it really isn't necessarily a function of you're doing that for a nonprofit versus you're doing that in the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Well, so I also saw one of your talks where you mentioned a common mistake that we as job seekers are making, and that we focus on getting the job that other people think we should get rather than the job we want to get. And I actually spoke with a job seeker this week, strangely, who expressed this exact issue. She had been encouraged by teachers and family members to explore one career path and to ignore everything else. And, in her 20s, she's now, has a degree and is now working in this field and has come to realize that she actually hates it and is trying to figure out what to do. So I'm curious, from your perspective, like, how can we avoid this problem altogether? I mean, what can we do?
Yeah, so it's a tough one, I think, and I also see it in the context that I'm in here, with students who are going through a master's program, many of whom are career switchers and are looking to shift. That it can become easy, whether it's familial influence, whether it's peer or cohort influence, to get caught up in either what other people sort of feel and have defined as being desirable work or desirable firms to work for, as opposed to having people focus on what would the day-to-day experience of doing that kind of work be like, and what would it be like for months, and what would it be like for years, and is the actual are the mechanics of doing that work something that feel important and compelling? And if the answer is no, but the title is alluring, or the firm is hot, or the the level at which I would be paid, and how much status I would have looks good, I would urge people to really shy away and to put much more weight on what is the actual experience of sort of consuming the tasks of the work on an ongoing basis. And I think there's a pretty common error that lots of people make, where they underweight that, and they overweight how exciting might this seem to other people, as opposed to really, centering on the idea that nobody's going to go to that job with you except for you. And so if it's not the job that you would most want, even if no one were looking, even if no one ever knew what your job title was or how much you made or what firm you worked for, then I think that's reason to pause and to really think about, well, what would you do differently if that was the scenario you were working in, and why not move it more in that direction?
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think for some people it's tough, though, when you have so much family pressure, especially, to push you in a certain direction, to say, I think I'm going to do my own thing and I'm going to listen to my gut on this. I think that can be tough.
I think so too, and I think it can become then a gradual process of morphing, sort of over given how many times people tend to change roles over the course of their career, to maybe take slow steps toward work that may be a better fit over time, ideally. One of the toughest things I ever had happen is years ago at another institution teaching undergrads. And teaching topics related to motivation, and the impact that it has to be sort of truly and internally motivated for the kinds of things that you're pursuing, versus it's happening more because of outside pressures and so on. And there's, again, a lot of research to back this up, both on work and in education. And having students come to say, to office hours, to say, well, I'm here and I'm majoring in X, and I'm majoring in X because that's the major my parents would pay for. But I love Y, and if I could, I would devote my life to Y. And so what do I do? And these are heartbreaking situations, hard. Right? I mean, this is such a tough thing. There's a great talk on that's easily accessible online of J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, giving a commencement speech at Harvard where she talks about lying to her parents. They had paid for, or had sent her off to college to do, I'm now forgetting it, maybe an accounting degree, something that was very practical, and she sort of ran from that and became a classics major. And I mean, I think the world is better off with J.K. Rowling as an author and creator, given her talents. But this was something that she did in direct rebellion, sort of, from her family, and it's tough to know how to counsel, a 19-year-old who is looking at either having to leave college and forgo the education or do the thing that their parents most want them to do, which I think is coming out of a place of great concern and love by the parents. They want the kid to have a secure job. They want them to, have a steady, solid place in society and so on. And so it's, I don't think it's necessarily out of a, out of a place that's not one of concern and love for the kid that this kind of thing happens. But you do wonder about people who end up then in jobs that are highly practical but don't grab any of their soul.
It's such a hard issue. And so sad. I sometimes wish I could talk to the parents and say, hey, this is what they really want. They're going to be so much better at this, Well, so you mentioned a couple times like the idea of job switching, and we're talking sort of about parents, which kind of brings up the idea of generations. And I'm curious if you think that job switching and switching more often is a generational thing. Is it something that you're seeing more now than we saw in the past?
Well, I mean, I do think it's happening more in modern times than it had in generations past. There is a robust debate in some of the literature that I live in around, that the good old days were never really the good old days, that there was always more employment instability than we tend to remember when we look back. But the fact is, I would argue that organizations have increasingly become sites of sort of personal development and learning with the idea that you'll move on from there to something that's coming next. And it's surprising, I think, in the modern era, the extent to which organizations very much almost build themselves that way. Come here and we'll teach you all kinds of things and you'll be able to develop your career and become even more marketable is a very different value proposition, if you will, for joining, then come join us and we want you to build your entire career here. We want to develop you and capture that value by having you stay and contribute in different ways over the course of your time. I think by and large, and I'm talking very much in generalities, I should note that by and large, the relationship between employees and organizations has become, I think, more episodic and more temporary and clearer sort of on both sides that that's what's happening. So I do think, in the end, even though there's data on both sides of this, that certainly the expectation that people have going into the workplace is that they're going to be moving around much more than it had been, a generation or two ago.
Mm-hmm. I could see that a lot. And I think one thing, too, that we probably think about more than in the past is the idea that we might be laid off or fired, like that it's just our workplace is not as stable. And that kind of brings up, for me at least, the thought of unemployment and maybe how it, being unemployed can sort of impact our identity and how we think of ourselves. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what does happen to our identity when we become unemployed?
Well, it's a great question. So unemployment is a great sort of untethering, if you will, for people where their organizational affiliation, their ability to claim their occupational or professional identity becomes challenged, where even the structure of their day, of their social network, of their routines becomes interrupted in ways that we know from research are highly challenging for people to weather. I think that for me, some of the more interesting literature in this area suggests that you would think perhaps that people who have more solidified professional identities might be better off because they have that sort of occupational identity and so on. The evidence that I have felt very compelled by is that, in fact, it's the reverse, that they're the ones who suffer the most, because not only have you lost, a stream of income, you've lost a place in the organizational world, but you've lost your claim to the occupational sort of identity that you had previously held as an important and key part of your identity. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're working in a job and you see that job as a job, and I go in and I work at the store or I work for the firm, even if you're doing the same kinds of work as someone who identifies as a professional, you haven't lost that tether to how you think of who you are. You've lost more the income stream or the position in the organization, not necessarily as much a part of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so it's, there's some really good sort of classic work on this, that it's quite different to lose an income stream than it is to lose what you think your position in the world is. And to the extent that people freight their work with different amounts and ways of thinking about their identity, you end up seeing that a lot in periods of unemployment that for some are clearly challenging. There's work, income, insurance, sort of all of this that has to get replaced where there's a search. It's a huge amount of effort to do that. But that's, I would argue, not as challenging, and the research evidence would suggest that's not replacing an income stream, and seeing one's work that way is not as challenging as replacing an income stream and insurance and all the things that go with that, and trying to hold on to both the type of identity one thought one had and the level at which one was working in that identity in an occupational or professional infrastructure. That's a lot more pressure, and that pressure comes down to how we think about ourselves.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I could totally see that. I mean, the folks that I've talked to over the years who are in, say, like a C-level, whether it's like chief marketing officer, CIO, whatever the position, it maybe took them 20 years to become the chief marketing officer. But when they went through the unemployment phase, they really needed to have a new job in just a few months. And it just took so much longer to find, because they wanted to get that C title again, and they wanted the money that came with it and the status and those things. I mean, the first time they were the chief marketing officer, it probably took their entire career to get to that point. And I think I was looking the other day at the average number of years each C-level executive is in the career at this point. And I think for like a chief marketing officer, it was maybe like 4 years or so. And it's almost like that person, they focused on becoming that chief marketing officer, and they never thought about what happens 4 years later or what happens 5 years later. Yeah. And it's such a tough thing, because you spend your whole career getting there, and then the lifespan is just so tiny.
Yes. I think, that in that point, I think you're helping me, to make a point that I had started on earlier, which is perhaps a controversial point to make. And that is to say, for someone for whom their career has been primarily focused on advancement to get that, to grab that brass ring, for lack of a better word, to get that title and to sort of make it, right? I would argue that's largely an instrumental set of goals, as opposed to, I love marketing. I want to devote my life to doing it well, to understanding it, to being in organizations and contexts that are doing it in really interesting ways where I have the opportunity to engage with that. And whatever they call me, I don't care if I'm doing work that I find engrossing and that I think is the best kind of marketing work that's out there that's happening. That's a very different nature of, or way of attaching to the work than doing the work because you're in some sense, mapping out a path and keeping score and looking for the positions and the promotions and so on. And so you can imagine someone in the first category having much more trouble than someone in that second category having lost a chief marketing officer job, relocating themselves into doing marketing work, because in the first case the point was to get the chief marketing officer role, and so to give up that role, that's sort of the meaning that they've attached to their work, as opposed to what the work itself consists of. What the work itself consists of is what you connect with and what you relate to and what you love, then it becomes easier to accept work that allows you to continue doing that, even if it doesn't necessarily carry the same title.
Absolutely. Gosh, I wish we could just talk all day. This is such
really fun.
A good topic. Well, so Amy, where can we go to learn more about you and more about your work? I know you have a ton of great talks online, and where can we find these things?
Oh, thank you. So I'm embarrassed to say I don't have them all. I should collected in one spot, but I do. I have my website at Yale University that through which you can find all of my research papers and work that I've done and have published is downloadable there. And as for the talks, my guess is just Googling my name and looking for you can do the Google tab for videos. I think all the talks are collected there. I'm actually a huge introvert, and so I've not ever watched a talk that I've given, and so it's probably why I haven't collected these things into a single place. But I do know they're out there because I hear people telling me that they've seen them, and I cringe every time I hear that.
Oh, they're wonderful. Well, I will put links to everything in the show notes so we can find them and we can watch your talks. They're really great. Amy, thank you so much for joining me. This has been excellent.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to Angela@CopelandCoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @CopelandCoach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.